Hey all, this is Darren, head of remote at GitLab, and today I'm joined by Mårten, the CEO at HackerOne. And today we're going to talk about advice for companies that are suddenly remote. So I actually helped Mårten edit a Fast Company article, which I will link down in the show notes. And we had some conversation on should teams dive into new tools if they're in this situation, or should they minimize their tool stack and kind of reduce the chaos. But we want the conversation to be even bigger than that. We're getting input from companies everywhere that they're suddenly remote and their whole team is working from home. And there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of chaos in that, and we're hoping to stabilize as best we can. So Mårten, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me, Darren. Happy to be here.
So where to begin? What's the biggest thing you're hearing from peers and other companies now that they're suddenly remote? What do they need? What advice are they looking for? Do they start with tools? Do they start with culture? What are we hearing, and what should we recommend?
I think they're starting with questions, which is right. They contact me and others and say, I need to go remote. I am remote. How do I manage through this? And they ask about tools because it feels like that's the biggest problem. I think the biggest issue is the mental preparation for being online. That's why I think it's about culture and conduct and sort of what's happening in your brain more than what's happening in the tools. And I've done virtual teams for 20 years, and I know you can do them with whatever tools you have. So therefore, I stress the things that go on in your mind and how you just relate to the virtual environment, which is funny. We call it a virtual environment to say working from home and distributed, and we think it's something unnatural. I think civilization is flipping. The natural way will be this, and in person will be the virtual one or the unusual one just some years from now. So I do think the world is changing, and we all better use how to get to know people online, how to communicate with them, how to be authentic, how to be genuine. All these things need to happen online as well.
It's very interesting. I want to make one point about where I see this going, and then kind of come back to the what do we do now. But the way you just worded that actually connected the two in a way that I had not realized before. I actually think that what's happening now with COVID-19 is going to force the world to recognize and embrace remote in a way that would have taken at least 10 years or so otherwise. So I think this recognition has been accelerated by at least 10 years. And one thing that I've been telling people to kind of wrap their heads around it is I think the default is going to flip. So right now, people's default is to go into an office to do work, and the exception is to be home. So let's say the cable company has to come by, so you need to be home, or you need to leave early to go to a school recital, so you're just going to work from home that day. It's the exception, not the norm. Coming out of this, I think that's going to flip. The default will be you can find me working at home, and I'll come into the office only on special occasions. If there's a very special reason to be there, I will do that. And so that mirrors what you just said. We're in that transition period. So my initial question to you was going to be, how do you talk to leaders, team leaders and managers who may have never managed remotely before, on shifting that mindset and putting themselves in a position where they foster the atmosphere, they foster the culture of trust and transparency, and they get an understanding of what it takes to manage a remote team? Because I completely agree. If you go into this thinking, well, I'm going to manage my newly remote team by hammering out a bunch of rules and regulations, and I'm just going to do the command and control thing to make sure everyone's working or to make sure I know what's going on, I think it's going to backfire. You, in fact, need to release even more and let people be even more autonomous, but with clear guidelines, and give them the right tools, give them the right communication forms. So it's partly creating the structure where they feel comfortable communicating, give them the right tools so that they have their metrics, give them the tools they need to meet it, and let them do it any way they see fit. But what do you recommend on that shifting mindset? I almost think it's something that has to be learned almost. It's almost like we need a boot camp, like a training boot camp, because managing in the office and managing remotely, there are some
we have the boot camp, Darren. We have the boot camp. It's called coronavirus, and now we are forced to it. I think it's a question of unlearning. I think business leaders have learned the wrong practices in the offices. They believe that they can, with their eyes, observe if somebody is working hard. and they think that is the measurement, and therefore they haven't developed metrics to measure deliverables and results. They have developed a fallacy of thinking that command and control exists. they may they may think that charisma is a way of leading, that you go into the office and you radiate something and suddenly everybody is aligned. And all of those are fallacies that are exposed when you work in a distributed fashion. But so first you are shocked and you think that you've lost all your leadership powers. But in reality, it's the fallacies that have been taken away, and all that remains are the true things that constitute leadership. Meaning, how do you listen to somebody? How do you influence them? How do you mutually arrive at something so that both are committed? Like, how do you create mutual commitment? And when you do that and get over that hump, and when you start sort of loving your laptop, you have to sit here at home and think, this machine here, I love it. It's my window to all these fantastic human beings, and I love the human beings that I'm seeing there, and I'm comfortable with it. Then with that mindset, you can build leadership and alignment and give instructions, receive feedback. You could ask, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Is this a good day or a bad day for you? And you can translate everything you had in the physical office into this excuse me, into this digital realm where we now exist. And then it works, and then it will feel so real. People don't believe it, but it will feel completely real. And afterwards, like you and I now, we're interacting here. Years from now, when we meet in person, we'll be like, did we meet in person back in 2020 or did we not? And we won't remember.
Yeah.
We won't have a distinction.
This is very interesting. One of the things that I've been advising people is to not implicitly try to copy the in-office environment and press paste into the remote environment, for a couple of reasons. One, it can be destructive, but two, you may be missing out on opportunities to do something fundamentally better. Like the thing you did in the office is actually the least effective way to do it. So don't try to do it virtually. Give yourself permission to completely wipe the slate clean and say, we want to get at this objective. This is how we used to do it in the office, which no longer exists. So is there a better way to do it here? But the interesting thing about what you said is that so many managers may have gotten to where they are, and things tend to work in the office by the whole charisma personality. Like it actually has very little to do with the authentic relationships with people or the actual work. And so now if you take them out of that environment, it could be jarring on a personal level. Like, oh, everything that I've been conditioned to do now doesn't really matter or matter as much. Is that something that, I mean, I do agree that there's as much to unlearn as there is to learn. Is there any recommendation on kind of getting past that? If managers, I think some managers will see this as a blessing, like, oh, good, I don't have to put on that persona in the office. I can actually just lead authentically. But for people that struggle with that, what's the advice there?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that this will favor the bold. Like if you are a manager or leader and you move to another country and you start managing there, you are in a new situation, new cultural norms, everything. But if you're bold, you go into it, you learn it, you figure it out, and then suddenly you are successful in a new environment, or you move from one part of the country to another. This is similar, that you have to think of it as moving to a new country, learning a new language, and realize that you have to build up from a lower level than where you were, that you had achieved some sort of status or prominence in the real office. Now you go to the digital office and you disappear. Nobody sees you. You are not, people don't look up to you. They don't come and sit next to you at the lunch because there is no lunch to be had together. So you must, as a leader, you must acknowledge that you are starting from scratch again. And you have to build up the reputation. You have to learn the tools and the tricks, and like how do you can think of every little thing you are doing in an office and figure out how you should do it digitally. How do you thank somebody? How do you do banter and pranks and jokes with somebody? How do you walk up to somebody and say, hey, could you help me a little bit, or could you help me think through this? How do you do that? Like, do you have to send a very well worded email and say, I would like some help on thinking through this little thing? And there's probably thousands of small tricks you have to learn before you're proficient. And when before you learn them, you may feel it's hopeless, and you may say, well, this is not my world, I don't belong here, I can't work here. And then you get into sort of a negative spiral where you think it's not for you. It is for you, but you just have to realize it's like if you move to China to run a business there. You'd have to learn a lot of tricks of where to get food, how to communicate with people, how they read you when you say things. What do they understand it as? How much should you adjust your communication? Like, I learned it way back when I was CEO of MySQL, and I'm exaggerating now, and I apologize to all nationalities that I may offend. But when I communicated, I felt that if I just said everything is wonderful, then our Russian employees would freak out because it sounded so unauthentic. If I then said that everything is breaking down and falling apart, then the Californians couldn't handle it because they need good news. So whatever I said, I had to say, it's wonderful, but we have problems. Or we have a big problem, but it's not too bad. I always had to contrast the message. And it applies more broadly that we have to adjust the tone of collaboration, communication, so that it fits in a new medium with new people. And and that's wiring that's on a very low level in the human mind. So you sort of have to unwire and rewire yourself on a pretty low level. And you have to understand that you are sort of rebooting yourself for a digital world.
This is super deep, and I really agree. One of the things that I've been recommending for leaders is to resist the urge to just come in like a wrecking ball, set up a bunch of rules, and instead just listen. Provide feedback mechanisms, a single source of truth where all of your distributed team, they're going to have systems access issues, they're going to have communication issues. Give them a place to provide feedback, and your first job should just be to listen and read. And this goes in lockstep with what you're saying, which is to take a step back and relearn. Learn what the issues are for your team so that you can then understand how to best help. And I think that part two of this is the easiest way to get in that mindset is to just become a servant leader. Servant leadership is going to be absolutely necessary because you're relearning everything. You're rebooting everything. What used to work in the office not only isn't applicable anymore, but you have new challenges that your team is facing. They have new workspaces. They have new infrastructure on their network. They have new demands going on around them. Their office environment has changed. So it's actually a higher burden on the manager to step all the way back and say, I'm just here to help. Like, that's my whole job.
But this is this is the key question, Darren. Sorry for interrupting you, but in a way, now somebody will listen to this or see this and say, "Oh, so do you mean that servant leadership is the only way to operate in a distributed world?" Well, then it's not for me, because not all leaders want to be. They don't subscribe to servant leadership. So I've asked myself, like, I believe in it, and I think it is the most powerful form of leadership, value-based or servant leadership. But then I'm thinking, is there a way of doing command and control digitally as well, or is it just because I am not like it that I don't favor it? And I actually think you can apply command and control when you need it, and I know that I have to do it at times. I try to be the servant leader. Every now and then the situation is so chaotic or so dire that we need an absolute decision and a command and an instruction and punishment if you don't do it.
Right.
And I realize even that will work. You have to build trust through being authentic and servant leadership or whatever form you follow. But there are moments where even online you issue orders, you tell people to shut up and just get their work done, and there's moments when it's needed, and it does work even if you're not in the same space.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I do think if you're being thrust into work from home and everything is suddenly new, I would say you're better off starting from the position of, let's build some trust. I'm open to feedback, because then what it does is it sets the stage for, if you do need to do that, if you do need to say, this needs to happen right now, you have at least built the foundation that people will take that seriously. Whereas if you just start from that, they have no idea how genuine that is. Like, how urgent is it really? I have a lot of chaos going on.
Very good point. I completely agree. So maybe now you provided the answer to your own question, that a leader who's for the first time leading a work for home team, what they have to start by is just listen and be available and learn and sort of read the signals that their team will give them, and then build trust, rebuild trust, although there was trust before, but build it in the digital world.
Yeah. I want to touch on productivity. So a question that I'm getting really often is, how do you measure productivity remotely? And I'm almost stupefied by this question, because I ask, how did you measure it in the office?
Exactly.
So this is a bit facetious, but what I want to say is, did you just measure their performance based on how many minutes in a given year that you could lay eyes on them? Did you really just sit in a room at the end of the year and say, this is how many minutes I saw you? It is a high number, therefore you get a promotion. Surely not. So if you were measuring something in the office, there has to be a way to measure that. Am I misunderstanding this question? I honestly, it's stupefying. I don't understand what the core part of it.
I love this, because I'm of the same view, and I even say that it's much easier to fake it in an office. I know how to fake it in an office.
Much easier.
Dress nicely, not too nicely, but nicely. Always talk to the boss. Make sure you're in the same elevator. In meetings, ask questions that sound smart-assy, like, so that you sound really intellectual and smart. Have a desk that's suitably messy, but not fully messy, but also not completely clean. And a few other tricks, and then everybody will think that you work really hard. And of what I mentioned, there was no mentioning of deliverables, of the results. When you work from home, the only thing you have to show for you is the results you deliver. So it's much easier when you work from home. What's more difficult is to take action if there's underperformance. That I admit. If you have a colleague far away who is underperforming, the act of helping and encouraging and stimulating and performance managing is more difficult. So that I completely agree with. But the measurement of results is easier when people work from home, because they will figure out how to present what they are producing to you.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I've advised is, if you're having that issue, it may be on the manager to make the metrics more crisp. Perhaps there's just too much ambiguity in what you expect from this person, because it's not about how can I measure something. It's about how can I give someone something that is more crisp, that they can actually deliver on. Because honestly, you should be able to give them metrics that they can deliver on regardless of where they are, whether they sit in cubicle A or cubicle B in the office, or whether that cubicle is their home now. And a lot of, I think,
yes, all that there are roles that are difficult to set a numerical metric for. Like if you work in a supporting function, then it's difficult to say you need to handle this number of something per day. And you want more than that. You want good vibes. You want people to be happy with the service, but you also want it to be regimented enough. So it's difficult to define what is perfect performance. Say you have a receptionist in a physical office. What is the role of the receptionist? Is it to make sure everybody signs the NDA, or is it to receive a number of guests, or is it to make everybody feel special, or is it to detect what's going on in the company? There are many roles a receptionist can play, and it's difficult to set one numerical performance goal. And if you do that, you probably will have to put one of the less important ones, like how many guests did you admit per day, which is not the right goal. So I don't think there are good metrics for every job, but I do think the problem is the same in a physical office and in a distributed organization, and maybe a little bit easier in the distributed organization.
That's good context. One analyst I spoke with said that the struggle here is that, in an in-office performance review, subjectivity plays a massive role, even if no one talks about it. In the receptionist example, so much of that would be the subjectivity, because you just kind of get these passing thoughts of like, hey, I really enjoyed my welcome to the office today, as someone enters a meeting with you. That's going to tell you over time, my receptionist is doing a great job. But there's no way to create a metric with that unless you like literally tally how many times someone said something positive to you. But that doesn't mean that if they didn't say something, the receptionist wasn't doing a great job. It just means that they didn't happen to mention it. So I guess I do sympathize with that a little bit more. In some roles,
Yeah.
it can be hard to quantify. Like, how do you add subjectivity? Um,
But this is why then in a distributed organization, you have to build the channels for those other signals, the weak signals. Like, how do you collect from the organization the vibes on what's working and what isn't? And how do you let people thank each other, show gratitude to each other, but also a little bit complain about each other, because you want to know that as well. And you don't want to formalize everything into a performance review. So you must set up Slack channels or whatever, where you let people sort of let that shine through somehow without it being offensive to anybody and without it being too official, but so that you could a little bit see how people are, what people are thinking about each other, what they appreciate about each other, and also what they complain about each other, because that those are useful signals. They are not the metrics of productivity, but they give you a sort of a color to what the performance of a certain person is.
it's
And I try to pay attention to those weak signals so that I have, because I think they give me a deeper understanding than just the sales number or have you produced the number of leads that we asked.
It's a great point. I think transparency is at the heart of that. So at GitLab, we are extremely transparent, and we have a dedicated thanks channel our Slack in our Slack instance, and we encourage people anytime that someone helps out or they get some positive feedback from a client or what have you, to just put it in there. Like, it can be just one line, and we try to encourage that with our values emoji. That way, it kind of reinforces the values, reinforces the thanks. But also on the other side, we encourage public discourse over private discourse whenever possible, so that we can discuss issues out in the open in the respective Slack channels, and you can see the friction and you can see what the solution ends up being. And it's useful to have that, because in a digital environment, if you don't do that, there's no way to overhear, there's no way to get any vibes or weak signals. But that requires some rewiring and some unlearning as well. A lot of people are uncomfortable with that because they've only ever used textual communications to be either private or negative. They've never really discussed full projects out in the open. So that takes some relearning for sure.
I think that's a very, very important point. And you have to be accept that not everything will be pretty. Like, you have to accept that on some communication channels it will look ugly, but that is exactly what creates the authenticity, and you shouldn't freak out because it's ugly. And there could be a tendency by a sort of traditional leader to go into the digital world and try to make it pretty, like, let's make sure we are professional, let's make sure we speak with respect to each other. And if you drive that too tight, then there is no room for this, the the social banter and the ugliness of a conflict and solving it in public. But you just have to take that. You have to wash some laundry in public and be ready for it, and not let it not let it anybody be doomed by it. Like, somebody will say something stupid, somebody will prove them wrong, they will apologize, and then you have to move on, and then you have to accept them and say, these both of them are wonderful people, they're perfect, and the fact that they could expose their vulnerability in a way to the whole group and fight it out in public, that is actually a sign of strength, not a sign of imperfection. But that could be difficult if you are trained to go to the office and dress up and make sure everything looks pretty, everything looks formal, everything looks nice. And if somebody is not nice, you immediately go into a closed group to solve it in private.
Yeah.
In the digital world, we wash our laundry, some of it, in public. And the more we can do it, and I think GitLab is, you're amazing there in how you're driving it. You're probably the most extreme in a very positive sense in that regard, and you are setting a trend for everybody, like you did when you had the outage, or you mistakenly deleted some backup some years ago, and somebody made the bold decision to let people follow the recovery in real time in your document, seeing your internal discussions, how you figured out what had gone wrong. And it must have been painful in the moment, but it created trust in GitLab for years.
Yeah. And I would say other companies that may be thinking, how do I set up the atmosphere for that? How it feels to me being here at GitLab is it's enabled by documenting values that encourage it. And three come to mind. We have a sub value of see each other succeed, which means that we can wash the laundry in public. There can be friction, but at the end of the day, we all know that we're trying to see each other succeed. No one is trying to see each other fail. That allows us to have that conflict and know that we're working towards the same positive goal. The other is no ego. So we try to have the most explicit conversation about it, and it's not about someone's agenda over someone else's agenda. It's about, I strongly believe this is the right move for the company and for you, and here's why, and take the people out of it. And the third one is short toes. We have a sub value called short toes, and I love this because it essentially says no one can step on anyone else's toes because we all have short toes. So you have to take any advice and any feedback from the perspective of, this person isn't trying to intentionally step on my toes. This person isn't trying to put their own ego above mine. And this person genuinely is trying to see me succeed. And all of that ends up being, we just try to assume positive intent in all things. But if those weren't documented, it would be really tough, because there would be some conversations where it immediately would trigger this red signal. I'm going into crisis mode, fight or flight response. And for remote teams, having that documented is so essential, because you don't have those in-office vibes to kind of control how this conversation could go. You have to have it documented.
That is wonderful. How do you deal then with egos? Because egos pop up here and there. Like, some people always have them and some people sometimes have them. But how do you deal with it at GitLab when you realize that somebody is acting more as a function of their ego than as a function of what they're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I mean, it can happen. I think what's interesting about it all being written down is, and we have this mentality of, we can answer anything with a link. The actual goal is to be able to answer anything with a link, something that is documented to act as the North Star. And what I've seen is, especially when, and this is a more minor case, but if a new person comes in, for example, and they've got some old prior organizational baggage, they aren't quite hip on how GitLab does everything. So we try to start all of our projects in GitLab issues, not in Slack. We don't want to do any work in Slack. We try to use Slack for informal communication. But this is very unusual. So sometimes you'll see someone try to start a project in Slack. Like, you'll see this 4-paragraph thing pop up and you're like, oh, I know what's happening here. You're trying to ideate something. And so we will just simply link them over to, like, this is how we use Slack. Here's the link. This is how you should actually start this. And you just correct people in public, because then anyone else that thought that was a good idea will see that and be like, oh yeah, that's right. Like, I saw that in onboarding, but it feels so unusual. So now I'm going to do it. The ego thing, honestly, I have seen it from time to time, where someone will comment on an issue and say, hey, I just want to remind everyone, this is our North Star. Like, let's all please try to assume positive intent. Let's all try to have no ego in this, and let's all focus on what the outcome should be. And this happens at GitLab. It is not taboo to see someone just say, this is the way that it should be. And I think the enabler there is the person doing the correcting. It's not about them. They actually just say, this is what we believe. I'm just reminding you what's already written down. This isn't about my opinion. This is what we believe as a company. Please read this and act accordingly. It requires that documentation. If that weren't documented, it would allow the other person on the other end of that to say, why are you correcting me? Is this in your own agenda? But the link removes that. It's like, it's not about my agenda. This is what we all have to believe on if we're going to work towards the goal.
That is very cool. I'm just getting excited about it. How do you then deal with, behind the link is some text? Who decides what it says there? Who has the final say on edits to that text? Because they're all then, in a way, policy documents, whether described as such or not.
So if it's individual policy docs, one discussion going on right now is our finance policy for spending company money is spend money as if it's your own. And that even applies to when people set up their workspaces. And so we have some general guidelines in there, but there's been some discussion recently of, should there be caps? Should there be something that if it goes above this, it then needs manager approval or something like that? And there's this huge discussion because it has always been spend company money as if it's your own. So now if we're going to change this, this isn't something that should just like happen overnight. So at the end of the day, the code owner for finance would be the chief financial officer. So if this were an issue that we're in people group, the code owner of that section of the handbook would be the person at the top on people, and so on and so forth. So for something that like that, anyone could create an issue or proposal on this is how I think we should change the wording, or this should be some safeguard that we put in place. But eventually it would have to be either merged or edited or rejected by the code owner of that site, which anyone can see who their code owners are. And so in this case, it would go up to the CFO. And until it is changed, what is on the site applies. Like that is what it is. Even if a discussion is ongoing for 3 months, during those 3 months, whatever is live is the directive. And that has to be firm. Like that is how we can have this discourse and it actually works, because we know that even if we disagree with it, we have to commit to it until it is changed. Now the values page, which drives the thing like no ego, short toes, that drives so many of the broader discussions and decisions. Sid, our CEO, is the ultimate merger on the values page. But what I love about GitLab is that this page is a living, breathing document. Just this year, I think we've had 4 or 5 different changes, mostly additions, clarifications on how we can live a certain value in a specific way. So it gives people yet another tangible example of this is how this value is lived out. And anyone in the company can make a merge request, create a proposal on how to add to something, how to change something, and then it would go to Sid and our CEO channel, and you can see the discourse on like, what is his thought on this? How does he see this playing out? Is this good? Is this bad? Is it indifferent? And I mentioned it, all of GitLab can make changes to this, but actually anyone in the world can. Just a few weeks ago, a community contributor, someone that doesn't work at GitLab, actually went through our values page top to bottom and submitted a merge request with some typo and grammar changes. Basically, they just cleaned it up. They were like, I want to make the flow a little bit better. This sentence would make more sense if it were arranged like this. And it actually got merged. Like now it looks a lot better. So it's empowering everyone to be invested in it. Everyone at the company knows that they themselves can make a proposal to actually change and improve the values that we believe in. That is incredibly empowering. But they understand that at the end of the day, Sid is the ultimate directly responsible individual for that. And so the proposal will have to be positioned in a way of, Sid, this is why I think this makes GitLab better. And so it puts the burden on them to make sure it's a clear and compelling case.
So how do you then deal with this situation where in the world of servant leadership, a policy document should ideally just say, use your best judgment. Like you said, spend money as if it is your own. In command and control, we are used to setting limits and saying, this is the hard rule, you must do this, you can just spend $35 on a lunch, and there are all these exact instructions. And if you have too much of the exact instructions, it becomes a nightmare. If you just trust people's judgment, then it turns out people have different judgment. How do you find the balance between those extremes when you author and edit these documents that instruct people on how to do things?
To some degree, I think it's kind of department specific. I think if you looked at our security protocols, like how we grant access to different programs, they're very specific because we have a globally distributed group of people. And we want to make sure that if they get access to something, it's very specific and that everyone else gets the exact same access. So there's no question about it. Like you actually get more calm by being more specific on that, because everyone knows, like you can read it in the handbook, this is how everyone gets access to it. Something softer like the spending company money thing. In instances like that, we try to err to let the person make the best decision. Like this is what they're aiming for. Let them get there in whatever way they need to. But we always give them permission to ask anyone if they feel unsure about it, whether that's their manager, whether it's in a public channel. anyone. You can always ask. You never have to feel like any stigma or taboo about asking for something. And if you do make a decision, like let's say you are the DRI and you go out and you have $1,000 lunch, then you're ultimately accountable for writing the comment of why you made this decision. And if it's a logical and reasonable proposal, then it's going to be fine. There could be some instances where the person who's making the decision fundamentally believes they made the right decision, and then the manager fundamentally believes they did not make the right decision, and then there would be a different path to go down there. I mean, that could be something like spending company money, but it could be anything, just overall conflict resolution. But I think the bottom line is err to the side of letting the person make the best decision based on the information they have, because ultimately they're going to be accountable for it. Like I'm the code owner for the all remote section of the handbook. Ultimately, I'm accountable for how that looks to the world. So I care about it a lot. And if you give people that accountability and you give people that responsibility, great people honor it, respect it, and tend to do the best they possibly can. And so if they do make a mistake and it's just glaring, then we work with them to fix it. Like no one's going to get let go at GitLab for making one boneheaded mistake. I mean, we all have our days where it's just like brain is not working. I mean, we're all human. We're not robots.
At MySQL, I issued an instruction once where I said, when you travel, try to save money on airfare and accommodation, because those are things that don't really, you'll never remember a flight. But if you manage to save money on those, reward yourself with a better meal, because a meal is something you will remember and it will enhance your life. But that was difficult to codify into the company as we grew. When people said, "Well, Mårten, how much? How much can I spend? How expensive can the wine then be?" And I wanted to tell them to just follow their own best instincts and make their best judgment. But at some point, the organization couldn't deal with it. So I think we set some fixed limits, and we lost some of the beauty of trusting people with their own best judgment.
And some of that comes with scale. I think it comes down to efficiency. It's at some point it becomes more efficient for everyone to put a high, like ideally a high cap on something, and just say that is the way it is, versus everything being a case by case. And I don't know if there's a super clear answer to that, because as companies get bigger, these things become more ambiguous, and you get a more distributed amount of people coming in. So it's a little bit harder to make happen. So GitLab's at 12.
That's the excitement of leadership, that you have to. There is no static situation. Everything changes, and when you double your head count, the rules have to be adjusted. When you go from physical to remote, you have to rewrite your rules. So the work of the leader and the manager is not going away. It will always be there.
Yeah. I want to wrap up with one final question, the question that actually was the impetus for having this meeting. So we were talking about tools. I want to hear your impression on how should leaders think about tools if they're suddenly remote? Should they try new tools out? Should they try to look at their current tool stack and see if it can do something that they weren't taking advantage of? Should they try to minimize their tools? What do you think is the best advice on that?
I may be a little bit of a contrarian, but I'm driven by, I do think the main thing is the mindset we have, how we conduct ourselves, and we could survive in any tool, in the environment of any tool. Then I'm also thinking that in a distributed organization, you must make sure that everybody gets heard. And if you have just one tool, you may lose out on some signaling, because people need to communicate at the same time over different channels. People have different preferences, different personalities. So I tend to allow a broader set of tools, so that the one who's good at typing can type, and the one who's good at doing pictures or video can do that, and we can somehow bring them together. But the guiding principle for me is, how do I make sure that everybody can get heard? And that's why I will allow more diversity in the tools. Others then say, let's stick to just one or two or three tools and have very clear rules for it, because then there's no ambiguity. And I agree, that's the benefit of it. I then worry that it doesn't allow for sufficient diversity of the people you have engaged. So that's why I would allow multiple tools. But I think it boils down to, in any organization, you need to have workflow tools. For every workflow, there needs to be a workflow tools. The simplest workflow tool in the world is email. You can do a lot with email, but it becomes complicated. So when the workflow has high volume or high complexity, you need a separate tool for it. You need tools for documenting project planning, management policies, like a document system of some sort. You could use GitLab for it. You could use Google Docs. You could use Atlassian, Confluence. There are many tools you could use. And then you need the everyday communication, the ephemeral communication. Video conferencing and a group chat tool, I think, are vital. I love them. I love being on calls like this with people. I love Slack, which we are using. I used to use IRC in the good old days, which Slack is sort of a next step from, because it gives me this immediacy with everybody. I can quickly ping you and ask you a question or give feedback or something, and I don't have to worry about exactly when you respond, but I know it will be quickly enough to keep me going. So I believe in all those tools, but I also think with every tool you have to keep polishing them and sort of and fine tuning them. Small things that are annoying, you have to learn how to deal with it. Like when you present, this is a silly detail, but when you present slides in, I forget which tool, the tool shows a little window saying you are now presenting your slides, and then it says hide. People don't know they can click the hide. They worry that they will hide the slides. No, it will just hide the little window. And I think it's worthwhile to learn that little feature, because it makes the experience so much better when you don't have to be annoyed by the little message on the screen. But this is just a reminder that the improvements you do are very minute and small, but given the volume of interactions we have and people we have involved, it makes sense because it saves a lot of stuff and makes it much quicker. I'll give you another example. We yesterday had a company meeting with 200 attendees at the same time. The conferencing software we used had some issue, bandwidth or technical problems. We couldn't hear each other. In 1 minute, we switched out to another. 200 people. We posted one link to everybody. Everybody switched over, and you could barely notice that we had moved from one platform to an entirely different platform, and we continued the meeting where it had ended. And I was just in awe that we could have 200 people who were so present, mindful, focused, that they knew exactly how to do it, how to mute themselves again, and all of that. And the meeting continued. But it's in the details. You have to be very particular with the small details of how the tools work.
Yeah, that's great advice. Give everybody the hunger for finding the small tweaks and the details, the kind of the pro tips. Just yesterday, we had 135 people on a marketing talent show. We had people, it was amazing. Families, cats, dogs, it was crazy. But in that call, people were, celebrating each other. And so everyone needs to kind of mute, unmute. And I said, actually, if you go to Zoom preferences and keyboard shortcuts, you can enable a global keyboard shortcut that you can map to your keyboard to just toggle mute on, mute off. You don't have to mouse over to it. And for the people that did not know that, it's like, that's a game changer. It's just such a small thing, but it's like, this infinitely improves my ongoing experience with Zoom. And
your CEO, Sid, tweeted it.
Right. Exactly.
So useful was the tip.
Yeah, exactly. No, I love that. I love that. Mårten, thank you so much for this. This has been an absolute pleasure. For those that are viewing, I'm going to put the GitLab handbook pages that we referenced down in the show notes. Mårten, anyone, any place that you want to tell people to look at to get in touch with you or HackerOne?
Just email me, Mårten@HackerOne.com, if you need a bug bounty program or vulnerability disclosure, or just you need hackers to help you. We're here to help you with that. But this was wonderful, Darren. Wonderful discussion, and I really look up to GitLab as one of the pioneers of how to operate a completely distributed organization. It's awesome what you're doing.
Awesome. That is very much appreciated. For those viewing, we hope you have found this helpful. And keep in touch with both of us on Twitter. We're doing a lot of webinars and panels to try to give people as much information as possible who are finding themselves suddenly remote. Thank you so much, Mårten. Have a good one.
Thank you, Darren. Take care. Bye.